Hey, this is Elijah with the Oxygen team, and in today's video, we're going to be building this kind of content section with some text on the right side and a sticky image element on the left side. Let me show you the two versions we'll be taking a look at today. As I scroll down this page, you'll see this image kind of appears on the left, and it's going to move with us as we scroll past this headline. And then it will slowly fade out as we scroll, and then another image will kind of pop in as we get to the next headline. So you can see this kind of effect on a lot of websites now. I feel like it's kind of a newer trend that has started to become popular. But I also have another permutation of this. So this version requires no code and just involves settings inside of Oxygen's interface. But this next version does involve a decent amount of custom code, but I'll show you how that works as well. So as we scroll down, it's a very similar looking effect, but we have this kind of transition that occurs that's implemented via CSS. And as we get to the next headline, instead of a whole new image element appearing, we'll actually just swap the image element out on this one to something different. So you can see as we get to each section, that image is going to transition to the appropriate image for that section. So now that you know what we're going to build, let's go ahead and jump straight into Oxygen and build this out. For the first version, we just need a section, and we can drop the elements in one by one like this, or we can use emit. So I'm just going to use emit to speed things up. We'll do Command or Control Shift E to bring up the emit input, and then we'll do a section, and we're going to need two divs. So we'll do div times 2. And then inside each of those, we're also going to need a div. So we can just do that here and go ahead and hit enter to execute that. So now we have kind of our basic structure set up. Let's pull up our structure pane so we can see what's happening here. So this will be our left-hand column. This will be our right-hand column. So in the section itself, we're going to go ahead and set it to horizontal layout. And then our columns we need to set to 50%. So we'll do 50% there and 50% here. So now we can get into dropping in our actual elements. So this div here is going to need to be 100% viewport height. So we'll go to advanced size and spacing. And before we get to styling anything that we're going to repeat, let's go ahead and add a class, and we'll call this sticky section image and add that class in. And actually, let's rename that because I'll probably use that class name for the actual image. So we'll say sticky section image wrapper. There we go. It's a bit long, but we can work with it. And then we'll get rid of the sticky section image class here, since we'll use that here in a minute on the actual image. So this one's going to be set to 100 VH, and then we can go ahead and just set the width to 100%. It won't matter a whole lot, but this will look a little bit better while we're setting things up. Now let's go ahead and drop in our image element. And we're doing this with emit, but you could do it by searching for the element as well. Since we're not doing complex structures now, I'll probably swap back to just searching for the element and dropping it in. Now the image has a few things going on. We have those kind of irregular corner radiuses, which we'll go ahead and set up. Let's go to first the media library and select our image itself. We'll choose that one, select the image and drop it in. Now we can go ahead and set up those corners here. So we can go to advanced borders and edit each individual radius here. We can do the top left of like 200 pixels, top right of 50, and then bottom right of like 300, something crazy like that. And then bottom left, we'll just leave it as a sharp corner. So that gives us kind of a cool funky shape for these images. Now we need to set it to position sticky. So we'll go to advanced custom CSS and set this to position sticky. And top something like 32 pixels. We might adjust that later. Actually, let's do 10%. I think that will work a little bit better. So that will ensure that it kind of sticks to our viewport as we scroll. Now let's go back and see if there's anything else we need to do on the image. And of course, we need our animation that occurs when the image comes into view. But we'll come back and do that because I'm going to base the animation trigger on the actual headline on the right-hand side. But before we jump over to the right-hand side, we do need to select this div that contains the image here, and we need to add a little bit of padding. So we'll do size and spacing and do maybe 32 pixels of padding. Then we are going to need to set this to advanced layout, position relative, because we need to absolutely position another div inside of here to get that kind of gradient fading effect that overlaps the image. So now we can do that. Let's go ahead and drop in a div. And we'll call this gradient overlap. and we'll go to advanced size and spacing. And actually that's wrong. Let's go to advanced layout because we're absolutely positioning this. We'll go to absolute here and we'll do 0 left, 0 right, 0 bottom, and then 25% top, I think is going to get us about where we want to be. Now we can go over to advanced background and we can set our gradient up. So we'll add 2 colors. One will be transparent and one will be white. But first I like to figure out where exactly these colors are. So this top one needs to be our transparent value. And then the bottom one, of course, needs to be our white value. So you can see as we scroll down, that image is going to fade behind that. Since we don't have an easy ability to trigger the animation out, this is kind of my solution to kind of make it more seamlessly fade away as we get to the next section. So I think that about wraps up the initial setup for the image side. Let's go over here and deal with the text side. So first, this div inside of here needs to be set up similarly with a height of 100 VH, and we'll drop that in and we'll just set the width to 100% as well. Now we're going to want everything kind of vertically centered in here, so we'll set it to vertical, left, and middle. And then let's add maybe a little bit of padding here. So we'll go size and spacing, do 32 pixels of padding. Now we're going to add a couple of elements at a time here. So we're going to go back to Emmet. So let's go Command or Control Shift E to bring that up. And now what we're going to need is an overline, a heading, and some text and a button. So we'll build that out in Emmet. So first, the overline is just going to be a text with a class of overline. We're going to have an H2 element, and we'll say important headline. Then we're going to have some more text. We'll add some lorem ipsum inside that here in a minute. Then we will have a link wrapper with some text and an icon inside. Let's go ahead and add a class to this link wrapper. We'll call it button, and we can go ahead and execute that to drop in that structure. Of course, it needs styled up, but that saved us a bunch of time. So we'll go over here to the overline first, and let's just make this a little bit de-emphasized on color. Make sure your contrast isn't too poor there though. And then we'll go to typography and change our font size to maybe 14 and text transform to uppercase. And we'll say overline text. Now here, we'll go over here and adjust our line height a bit since we didn't set it globally yet on this install. And then we'll just drop in some lorem ipsum here and shorten it down a bit. I don't think I want that much text for this particular instance. And then finally, we can style up our button. Let's go to advanced size and spacing. Let's add 8 pixels of padding on the top and bottom and 32 on the left and right. Then let's go to background and set the background color to black and go to typography and set the color to white. Then let's adjust our icon to something more appropriate. So we'll do like a chevron right type of situation. Let's drop that in and reduce the size quite a bit. And now we can adjust our text here and say learn more or something like that. Then we can go back to our button and make sure everything's laid out horizontally, centered in the middle vertically, and then we'll add a gap here of maybe 16 pixels. That looks pretty good. And speaking of gap, let's go back to this div that contains our text element, and let's set the gap to 32 pixels. Actually, that might be a bit much. Let's try 18 or 24. There we go. And then since we want this overline text right on top of the headline, we can offset that gap here by going to advanced size and spacing, setting the margin bottom to -24, which should put us right down there where we want to be. So now you can see we have this kind of scrolling effect. The nice thing is, because we've set all this up once, we now can just duplicate these and adjust the images on each one and the text on each one, and then we'll have that full section. So for this example, we'll do just like what I showed you at the beginning, and we'll do 3 of each. So we'll duplicate that twice, and then we'll duplicate this side twice as well. So now you can see we kind of have this effect. But like I said, we do need to set up the animation. So because I wanted to trigger the animation on the visibility of the headline and not the image element itself, I wanted to wait until these headlines were set up because we're going to use the headline IDs for triggering the animation. So we'll select this and copy it to our clipboard. Then let's go over to our image and we'll go to Advanced Effects, Animate on Scroll, and we'll enable animation. Let's do, I think we used flip up in the example, and adjust the duration here. And then we want to set our anchor to the ID of our heading. I think that will just about do it. So we'll need to use these same settings across all our image elements, except for the anchor. We'll need to use a unique anchor. So we'll remember flip up and 550 there. for the duration. And then we might want to set the animation easing to ease in out as well, because that generally gets a smoother result. So now we can replicate that with the rest of these elements. So let's grab this headline ID, go over here and go to Advanced Effects, Animate on Scroll, and set all that up one more time. Flip up, 550, animation easing, ease in, out, and then our anchor is going to be the ID of that headline. And for the final one, let's repeat that process. Grab this image, go to Advanced Effects, Animate on Scroll, Enable Animation. We're going to do Flip Up, and you could do a different animation on each one of these images if you wanted to vary it a little bit. Animation duration, again, is going to be 550. Animation easing is ease in, out, and for the last time, we paste in that ID. So now if we save this and go up to the front end, we should see the same effect that you saw at the beginning of the video. So let's try that out. So here we have our first one, which doesn't animate in because it's already in the viewport. Then our next one should animate in, and then here, our final one. Now we can't keep scrolling because there's nothing below this yet. There is one issue here that I noticed, and that's that our image doesn't completely fade out behind the gradient because our gradient stops aren't adjusted yet. So let's go back over here and we'll select this gradient. And the nice thing is we added a class, so when we adjust this one time, it will work across all of them. We'll actually work with this one since we can see the image there. We'll go to Advanced, Background, Gradient, and we can kind of adjust this stop to a percentage. We can try like 10%, which will move it up quite a bit, but we may not want something so aggressive there. We do want it to look like it's fading out, so we can try like 30%, 40, 50. 50 looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and see if that, yeah, that completely obscures the image by the time it's at the bottom of the section, which is the effect that we're looking for here. So with that, this particular implementation of this setup is done, and you can see what it looks like here. It's obviously not as fancy as some of the effects like this that you see where the images are animated or whatever, but it does achieve a kind of visually interesting effect and doesn't require a whole lot of work. Now we're going to get into the one that's a little bit more intense. So we can actually just duplicate this section, and we're going to need to restructure it a bit. So let me go ahead and hide this one here on the back end, and then we'll go to this new section. Now, in this case, we only need one image in this left column. So we can actually just move this image out and then get rid of everything else. We're also going to need to remove the animation on this because we don't need it in this case. Let's go to Effects, Animate on Scroll, and just disable the animation entirely there. The right-hand side can stay pretty much the same. We will need to make some adjustments code-wise with some attributes, but we don't need to restructure it. What we do need to do, however, is set this section to stretch our divs so that this one on the left is the full height of this entire section, which will keep that image floating along as we scroll through. So let's go ahead and save. I like to frequently preview on the front end just to make sure everything is working exactly as I intended. And this is our first section here, and then we can scroll past that to this section, and this is going to move along with us to each headline. Now, what we want to do, the effect we want to achieve, is that when these headlines come into view, we want to actually change this image. So we're going to need one thing here that we can set up quickly. We need a class on these headlines. So we'll say observe me. You would need to use something a little bit more unique on a real website, because if you have multiple instances of something that needs to be observed, you might not want to use something so generic. So in this case, though, for this example site, that will work perfectly. So we'll add that there, and then we'll add that class to the rest of these. And the final one here. We're also going to need the image URL that we're going to swap to when these headings come into view as a data attribute on these headings. So let's go back up to the front. I probably should have done all of that at the same time as adding the class, but that's okay. So this first one is going to have this URL. So we'll go over here and go to Advanced Attributes, and we're going to add an attribute called data-image URL, and then we'll just paste in that image URL. Then we can go down to the next heading and do the same thing. But we need this next image URL here. Grab that, go over here, Advanced Attributes, add an attribute, data-image URL, and paste that in. The reason we're doing this is because we're going to need a reference to the URL to swap it out on the image. without that, we don't really have a way to tell the image to use this new image that we want it to swap to. So this is the easiest way that I found to achieve this. So we'll go to attributes on this again, data-image URL, and paste this in. So everything on the right-hand side is pretty much set up. On the left-hand side, we do need to make one adjustment to this image, and that is we need to use the image URL instead of the media library, which is kind of a downside of this approach. The reason we have to use the image URL is because the media library option implements source set, and you can't just swap out the source whenever you want to and expect the image to change. At least in my experiments, it didn't work. So we have to go with the simpler route of using the image URL, which is no big deal. Let's go ahead and grab that so that it's on the correct starting image. Okay, now we are ready for some code, I believe, but the first thing we need to do is grab the ID of this image so that we have it handy, and then we can jump into a code block. So let's add a code block here. And again, we'll switch back to our normal search for a code block and drop that in. Now this probably should live outside this section maybe just so it doesn't throw things off. It also shouldn't be outputting anything. So we'll add an HTML comment here in the PHP editor, and that will hide the code block. Let's go ahead and move this section up so that our code sits right below it. Now let's start with the simple bit, which is going to be a CSS animation. So we need to go ahead and set up a class. We'll call it transition image. And this class needs to have an animation on it. So we'll do animation name, transition, animation duration, 0.5 seconds. And then we'll do animation timing function, ease in out. Now we need to actually create that transition animation. So we'll go down here and do keyframes, transition, and we'll do a 0%. The property we're going to be animating is filter. We'll do blur, 20 pixels. We want to start with a blur so that we don't actually see the image change. And again, this is a very basic effect. You could get very fancy with this, with the ability to add and remove CSS classes as these headings come into view. You could do motion animations and all kinds of really cool stuff. But for the sake of keeping this tutorial a little bit short, I didn't want to get in the weeds with all of that. So instead we just do a filter blur here. So let's do another filter blur here of maybe 50 pixels. So it's going to start at 20, go up to 50, and then at 100% we want it back down to 0. So we'll do filter blur 0 pixels. And that's pretty much all we need as far as CSS is concerned. And it's of course not going to do anything yet because we're not actually using it. Now, the more complicated part here is the JavaScript. So let's jump into JavaScript. And the first bit we need is kind of unique to Oxygen. We need a document ready event. Since we're not using jQuery, this looks a little complicated, but it's basically the same thing every time you need it. We'll do let ready and then callback here for our arrow function. And then inside that, we're going to do if document.ready state does not equal loading. We'll run that callback. Else, we will add an event listener to the document, and that's going to listen on the DOM content loaded event, and it will run the callback when it hears that happen. Now we can go ahead down and do some stuff within our ready function. So we'll do ready. Now, one thing I like to do when writing JavaScript in Oxygen is I like to do an if window.angular, then return. This tells my code not to run if we're in the Oxygen environment. This can prevent some minor errors from occurring. Now we need a variable that holds our image. So we'll do let image equals document.get element by ID. And remember, I copied that onto my clipboard so I can just paste it here. So that's this image here on the left-hand side. Since we only have one image, we can use the ID and it's no problem. Then we need to grab all of our elements with that observe me class. I think that's what it was called. Let's double check here. Yep, observe-me. Go back over here. So we'll say let triggers equals document.query selector all. So we're going to grab all of these, and then we'll pass in that observe me selector. So that'll give us a list of all of the elements that have that class. Now we need to create an intersection observer, which seems complicated, but it's really not too terribly bad. I'm still not super familiar with them, but with a little bit of Googling, they're pretty easy to set up. So we'll do let observer equal new intersection observer. And then within that, we're going to do another arrow function with entries and observer. And then within that function, we're going to go ahead and use our entries variable there. That's going to contain everything that's being observed essentially. We'll do for each, an entry, and then do some stuff with that entry. So if entry dot is intersecting, so we're checking if it's in the viewport, then we're going to do some stuff here. We'll do image.classList.add, and then we need to add that transition class that we created. I don't actually remember what it was, so let's jump over to the CSS tab here. It was transition-image, so we'll go back over here. So that's the class we need to add, transition-image. So that will kick off the animation whenever these headlines come into view. Then we need to listen for that animation to end and remove the class so that it can be re-added later when we need to run the animation again. So we'll do image.add event listener, and the event we're listening for is animation end. Then we'll do a function here, and when that ends, we want to do image.classList.remove, and we're just removing the same class that we just added, so transition-image. And the last adjustment we want to make to this image when the heading comes into view is to change the image's source. So we'll do image.setAttribute, and the attribute we want to change is source or src, and then with the value we want to set is actually our entry.target.dataset.image URL. So that'll grab that attribute value. Then what we need to do is go inside this set of parentheses right after this curly brace, and we can set up an object with some options here. So let's go ahead and move this back out of the way. And the option we want to set is threshold 1. This tells the intersection observer that we want to fire these events when the whole element is in the viewport. You could tweak this setting to get slightly different effects if you wanted. So now we can move down here and make the observer actually do its thing. So we go to triggers.forEach trigger, and we're going to tell the observer to observe the trigger. Okay, so let's go ahead and save. And assuming we haven't typoed anything, which I almost always typo when I write this code on these videos, so it'll probably happen, but maybe I got lucky and it will work perfectly. So let's refresh. So we have this first section, then let's go down and we should see that animation fire right there. Then let's go down and then we should see that image swap out and the animation fire. So it looks like we nailed it this time. Now, one way to spruce this up would be to use like animated GIFs or Lottie animations instead of static images, which is what I see in a lot of layouts like this. All of the same principles really apply. You can use the same exact structure and basically the same setup that I've used here to do that sort of thing. So let's take one last look at these two options. We can do this one here where it fades out and then flips in, which I didn't change the image on each one there, but that's just a matter of selecting each image and choosing the proper image from the media library. And then we have this more advanced option where we have this kind of transition animation and the one image remains sticky, but it changes its source as you scroll down. So again, this is Elijah with the Oxygen team, and that's how to create a sticky image scrolling section. Thank you very much for watching.